The words struck like a blade against seasoned oak, sharp and unyielding, impossible to retract. Al-Shabaab would scoff at a daughter like you, General Marcus Holt declared. He didn't mutter them in a quiet corner or hiss them in a private spat. He proclaimed them in the community center of Willow Creek, Texas, beneath banners strung across a modest stage, in front of rows of metal chairs occupied by men whose postures still bore the weight of their military service. Every head swiveled, every murmur fell silent. Marcus didn't pause. His broad hand clamped onto the shoulder of a young Marine standing tall beside him. "Now this," he boomed, "this is a true soldier." The men in the room nodded, some voicing quiet agreement, their gazes sliding past Elena Holt as if she were an empty seat. For Marcus, it was another opportunity to broadcast, to the room and to Elena, that she fell short of his expectations. But the Marine didn't grin. He didn't square his shoulders with pride. Instead, his eyes locked onto Elena's, and he froze. His throat worked as if swallowing shards of stone. Then, in a voice low but piercing enough to hush the hum of the overhead fans, he murmured, "Are you the Reaper's shadow?" The room seemed to tilt. Veterans straightened in their seats. A few exchanged glances laden with unspoken meaning. Marcus's jaw tightened, a flicker of confusion breaking through his polished smirk. He didn't grasp the question, or why those words carried a weight that reshaped the air around Elena. She stood motionless, offering no response, because sometimes silence speaks louder than words. But to understand what those words meant, why a battle-hardened Marine would falter at the sight of a daughter her father had just belittled, one must trace the winding path that brought Elena and Marcus to that moment in Willow Creek's community center. The center was far from grand. It smelled of stale coffee brewed in ancient machines, of floor wax applied by volunteers with aching joints, of time etched into the walls. Faded photographs lined the halls, sepia-toned faces of men who'd marched to war and returned, some whole, some fractured. Their eyes seemed to track you as you entered, a reminder that history lingers in the memories of those still standing. That evening was meant to honor service, to commemorate sacrifices spanning generations. Marcus was in his element. Even without a uniform, he knew how to dominate a space, broad shoulders, resonant voice, a chest that once bore medals but now carried pride. Elena had arrived quietly, slipping into the back with no desire for attention. She sought only a place among others who understood the cost of service. But Marcus had spotted her, and, as always, he chose spectacle over restraint. His words were not unexpected. They were a continuation of a lifetime of dismissals. In his eyes, Elena's efforts were inadequate, her choices misguided. She wasn't the son he'd envisioned. She wasn't the heir to his legacy. So, every opportunity to diminish her, he seized. But the Marine's reaction deviated from Marcus's script. Elena recognized that look, the sudden spark of recognition, the blend of awe and unease, the struggle to reconcile whispers with reality. The Marine had heard tales. Perhaps he'd served alongside men who, in the dead of night, when missions unraveled, spoke her name in hushed tones, someone who turned chaos into order. Reaper's Shadow. The name wasn't one Elena claimed, but it had been bestowed, earned in places where smoke choked the air and decisions were measured in heartbeats. It wasn't a boast. It was a specter that trailed her, a reminder of what service demanded. The veterans in the room might not have known the specifics, but they sensed the gravity of that kind of silence. For the first time in Elena's life, Marcus's voice wasn't the one commanding the space. That moment, suspended, delicate, heavy with unasked questions, was a turning point. Every slight she'd endured, every scar, every night she'd chosen the harder path, had led to it. But to grasp the full weight of that night, one must look back to where Elena came from. Not to the community center in Willow Creek, but to a small town in rural Texas, to a house where a father's pride cast a shadow that left little room for a daughter to stand. The house where Elena grew up was orderly to a fault. Floors polished on weekends gleamed like regulations, boots aligned precisely by the back door. The living room held two types of chairs, those for guests and the one Marcus claimed. You could tell as by the way the afternoon light fell across it, a patch of sun like a badge of rank etched into the rug. He taught Elena to stand at attention before he taught her to balance on a bicycle. Heels together, eyes forward. Don't shy from fear, own it, Marcus Holt instructed. Elena was 8, too short to reach the kitchen counter without a steps tool. Marcus would adjust her shoulders with 2 fingers, stepping back to assess her stance, chin tilted like a marksman aligning a sight. If she wavered, they began again. When she stood correctly, there was no praise, just a curt, again. On Sundays, the house in Willow Creek, Texas, smelled of brewed coffee, starched linens, and the citrus tang of lemon oil Marcus used to polish the glass case displaying his medals. He never spoke of the battles that earned them. Instead, he lectured on precision, polished spacing, exact sequences. Precision is respect, he'd say, nudging a ribbon a fraction to the left. The lesson stuck. Even now, Elena couldn't tolerate a misaligned picture frame. Her mother, Clara Holt, cherished the house but loved its people more. A schoolteacher, Clara carried sentences like treasures, tucking them into her pockets the way others kept candies. She slipped poems into Elena's lunchbox, Whitman when Elena felt defiant, Dickinson when she felt small. Read the last line aloud, Clara would say, and Elena would, and somehow the kitchen seemed to expand. Clara never challenged Marcus directly. She endured him, like a steady rock against a gale. Not every storm needs outrunning, she'd tell Elena, tracing a soothing circle between her shoulder blades. Willow Creek had its own rhythm. Flags adorned porches each May, timed like clockwork. Parades marched down Cedar Street on Independence Day, with tractor hums echoing from distant fields, high school football lighting up Friday nights, and the local VFW hosting fish fries where men with weathered hands swapped jokes older than the town's grain elevator. To the townsfolk, Marcus was a fixture, a monument needing no map to find. When Elena was 12, Marcus took her to a college football game in Austin, a Texas A&M versus Navy matchup. The stadium pulsed with cold air, brass bands blared, and cadets in crisp coats moved like pieces on a vast chessboard. Elena cheered for Navy until her voice cracked, and Marcus didn't hush her. He simply didn't look her way. "Leave those colors to men who can bear them," he said later, his tone as flat as a weather report. Elena kept her scarf on during the drive home, hiding the lump in her throat. At 14, Elena mastered the iron's weight while other girls learned makeup brushes. Shirts had to hold creases sharp as topographic ridges. Marcus taught her to shave fuzz from sweaters with a razor, to pair socks precisely instead of bunching them, to stack pantry cans with labels facing out for instant inventory. The pantry door's click still echoed in her mind, final as a judge's gavel. Elena excelled at Willow Creek High, a school that valued diligence. She ran cross-country because speed made sense when stillness didn't. She memorized the scent of the gym's hardwood in winter, the way chalk dust hung like mist in math class. A perfect test score earned a hum from Marcus, like a man checking a sundial. When she took first in a race, he said, "Don't overstride. Efficiency wins." The first time Elena mentioned joining the Navy, Marcus didn't shout. He folded his newspaper, aligning its edges with the tables, and said, "You lack the Constitution." The words slid across the linoleum, stopping at Elena's boots. She wasn't sure if he meant endurance or principle, perhaps both. "You want attention," he added, finally meeting her eyes, "not service." At the sink, Clara scrubbed her hands as if counting the 10 with each rinse. Elena applied anyway, late at night, her application glowing under a desk lamp with a shade Clara had painted with tiny ferns. She wrote of the Gulf breeze at dawn, of formations moving like a single breath, of loving a country enough to challenge its flaws. She didn't show Marcus the essay. She showed Clara. Clara read it twice, then pressed it back into Elena's hands, as if it were a weapon she should wield herself. "Keep this voice," Clara said. "The map will shift. Your compass mustn't." When a thin envelope arrived, confirming receipt, Elena tucked it inside a field guide to Texas wildlife. When the thick one came, it was March, and the creek behind the old sawmill churned with froth. Elena clutched the envelope to her chest, standing in the kitchen where the floor bore the memory of every inspection. She waited until Marcus sat in his chair. "Sir," she said, the word drilled into her, and handed him her future. He slit the envelope with a letter opener shaped like a dagger, read only the opening line, "We are pleased to offer," and stopped. He slid the letter back into its envelope, the envelope back to Elena, as if it burned his fingers. "We'll discuss logistics," he said. They didn't. At graduation, Clara strung fairy lights across the oak tree and set out lemonade in a bowl with a comically oversized ladle. Neighbors brought coleslaw and reminisced about Elena selling them cookies door to door, her braids always uneven. Marcus had a meeting at the Willow Creek VFW that ran late. When he returned, the lights had drooped in the heat, and the ice had melted into the lemonade. He went to bed without stepping into the yard. The morning Elena left, the sky over Willow Creek, Texas, was the pale gray of unstarched cotton. Clara tucked 3 envelopes into Elena's duffel. "Open when you're lonely," she said. "Open when you're hurt. Open when you forget who you are." She hugged Elena so tightly her ribs felt the count. Marcus stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, and said, "Check the tire pressure when it's due." "Yes, sir," Elena replied, and that was the farewell they shared. At the Naval Academy in Corpus Christi, the plebe summer stripped away everything not bolted down within Elena and then tested the bolts. She learned the briny taste of the Gulf Coast on dawn runs, the taut snap of a bunk sheet tight enough to deflect a coin, and the calculus of silence when words added nothing. Marcus's lessons honed her efficiency. Clara's made her resilient. On Sundays, Elena rode home. She described blisters, calling them proof of poor planning made visible. She wrote of women outpacing men who underestimated them, of the mess hall's clamor like 100 clocks in dispute. She sent 2 letters each time, one to Clara, rich with vivid descriptions, and one to Marcus, stripped of facts. His returned once, unopened, a crease slicing its center as if he'd folded her words in half. When Elena commissioned, her ensign bars gleamed under lights that exposed every scuff in the floor's polish. She mailed a photo. Clara placed hers on the mantel. Marcus tucked his into a drawer with spare fuses and elastic bands, practical things that eventually wore out. Then came the call no one is ready for, biopsy. Clara said the word like a test question she hoped Elena would misspell. Marcus sent updates via email, clinical as tide charts, dates, projections. Elena flew home when hospice arrived. The house smelled of disinfectant and wilted roses. The metal case still shone. Marcus stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, as if awaiting a tardy formation. Clara took Elena's hand and said, "Keep soaring. Not away, just up." It was the last directive Elena followed without question. After the funeral, neighbors brought casseroles and avoided looking past Marcus's shoulder. He repeated a story 3 times about a storm that felled the oak but spared the flagpole, and no one corrected his timeline. Elena scrubbed pans in the sink where she'd learned to stand rigid, reflecting on how love can be a house where the temperature is set to someone else's comfort. When she left, she didn't ask Marcus for an embrace. She didn't offer to return for Thanksgiving. She laid her hand on the glass case, letting its chill teach her one final lesson: respect doesn't equal permission. She saluted the man who taught her to stand tall and gave the rest of her resolve to a country vast enough to hold both their visions of duty. Elena didn't become who she was to defy Marcus. She became herself because the map kept whispering she could. Corpus Christi didn't love anyone. It measured you. Plebe Summer sanded away pretense, exposing who crumbled, who bent, who worked in silence. Elena learned to lace boots blindfolded and make a bunk so taut it resisted a slap. She mastered the rhythm of yes, sir or no, ma'am, and the discipline of breathing through the final 10 yards of a swim when her shoulders pleaded for rest. Pain became a metronome. Time was told by what ached. She wasn't the loudest in the corridors. She didn't need to be. She conserved words and wielded precision. When an upperclassman barked about posture, Elena learned the difference between standing still and standing ready. Ready carried weight, a vow to the person she'd be when the skies darkened. Commissioning day smelled of polished brass and fresh mown grass. The bars on Elena's shoulders didn't add height but reminded her spine of its purpose. Photos were taken in light too honest to flatter. She slipped one into a letter Clara could no longer read, then hid another under a drawer liner in Marcus's house when she passed through Willow Creek. He never mentioned finding it. Drawers kept secrets better than people. Elena's first orders sent her where maps frayed, near enough to the SEAL teams to feel their tempo, not close enough to wear their insignia. The pipeline wasn't hers, and she didn't push doors that wouldn't open. She went to San Antonio anyway, where the work pulsed. The Gulf slammed with both fists. Sand invaded everything deliberately. Men moved under logs like segments of a single spine. Elena matched their rhythm without claiming their place. At first, ma'am came with a question mark. She answered with plans that landed on schedule and briefs that didn't waste breath. She learned their language, how to hear the quietest man's rare words, to translate a grunt into a worry, a silence into a signal. She placed comms where hands could find them in the dark, batteries where hope promised they'd last, and water where pride would still reach. Combat's romantic sheen didn't survive the first checklist. War was logistics. Courage was a timetable kept when the clock turned hostile. Elena's role was to weave paths through neighborhoods that clashed within themselves and to craft contingencies, like spare ribs, around a plan's core. She stopped caring who claimed the credit. The measure was who made it home. In the desert near Fort Bliss, Texas, under a sun that scorched with intent, Elena and her team ran shoot-house drills until the plywood reeked of charred wood. She studied patterns, who scanned corners with their eyes, who announced them with their voices, who lingered a half-second in doorways as if checking a letter. She kept a green notebook, its pages brittle with sweat. Chief Torres, a grizzled man with a face etched like a topographic map and a laugh like tumbling stones, glanced at her notes and shook his head. "You weave nets," he said. "Spinning threads I can't see." Elena told him seeing wasn't necessary, feeling the threads would suffice. The first deployment forward carried the scent of diesel and overripe fruit left in the heat. Radios crackled like old men swapping stories. They operated from a borrowed room where a fluorescent strip flickered and the table tilted under Elena's maps. The target was a bomb maker who knew their cadence better than some recruits did. He bought tortillas at dawn and dealt death by noon. He favored the back door on Thursdays. They planned for Thursday but moved on Tuesday. The baker counted change slower on Tuesdays. Elena had studied his hands for 3 months. When a truck stalled 2 blocks short, Elena didn't wax poetic. Route C, Chapel, she said, pointing to 3 spires aligned on the map, her voice steady as a prayer. The pivot held. At the corner with the red gate, the target reached for a phone that stayed silent. They'd lulled its tower into a sleep it couldn't resist. His hands went behind his head, like a prayer's closing gesture. No explosions, no newsreels. Success that stayed silent because it left everyone breathing. Back in the room, Torres peeled off his gloves and tapped the web of marker lines like he was testing a gate. You wove it, he said. No smile, just the nod men share when the world doesn't worsen. A young soldier from Lubbock drew a small hourglass in the corner of Elena's map with a marker. Reaper, he teased. She told him to find a sharper pen. They didn't etch legends in permanent ink, but words traveled, on dusty hello rides, in mess halls where coffee tasted like discipline, rumors gained traction. The name drifted in from the enemy. It began as a curse, hissed into the night when an airstrike wove light into the ground and someone up there chose where not to aim. Elena wasn't on the trigger. She was the one steadying the frame for the shot. Reaper's shadow, an enemy snarled over an intercepted call, and the name found her on the ground, not because it fit, but because it clung. She never claimed it. Others did. A visiting commander shook Elena's hand once, trying the name like a borrowed coat. She slid it back across the table. I draw maps, she said. He grinned. Maps that make men feel untouchable for 10 minutes. I'll take that. Not every plan held. The first time one unraveled in Elena's hands, it tore loudly. A stray dog, unaccounted for, found courage at the worst moment. A helmet light failed. A vehicle sputtered at the wrong turn. She heard it in voices before it appeared on screens, a half note higher where fear crept in. Hold 2, she said. 3rd window, not gate. 4th, your pivot, 1 breath. Her voice stayed even because it had to, not because she was calm. Afterward, she sat on her hands to still their trembling. Torres set a water bottle beside her and said nothing. That's how men acknowledged she'd kept them safe. Loss came too, not the kind saluted around a flag with a bell's toll, though that came later. A different loss, a good man who began eating lunch alone, measuring doorways with his eyes, his jokes growing too sharp, a ring of salt on his desk where a coffee mug lingered because sleep didn't. They added a line to the checklist, who calls home if it goes wrong? And another, who checks the checker? Superstition, perhaps. But their numbers tilted towards survival. Elena stopped apologizing for quiet fixes that made brutal days bearable. During a brief stint back in the States, Elena drove through Willow Creek and past the community center, its flag hanging like a murmured vow. Marcus was likely inside, holding court, spinning a tale about a storm where he was the hero. She didn't stop. Reverence wasn't nostalgia. She parked by the creek and ran until the ache in her side shifted from blame to acceptance. Elena dated men who preferred women who stayed put. It went as expected. One tried to fix her schedule, another her voice. A third claimed he admired strong women, until her strength wasn't a role she could shed. The only ones who didn't ask her to shrink were those who understood operational risk. Love, Elena decided, would have to find her in a space that knew silence wasn't absence, it was capacity. Back on deployment, a young soldier named Javier arrived, jaw set like he was bracing it against a tremor, the kind of raw good the world consumes without shelter. He briefed too quickly. Elena slowed him down, asking him to repeat the mundane details. The boring parts keep you alive, she said. He knocked twice on her table before leaving, a ritual the platoon had adopted, like armor, strongest when believed in together. Years later, Javier would be the man who saw Elena across a crowded community center in Willow Creek, Texas, and forgot how to breathe. First, he learned to share his breath. Elena and Javier reworked a training block she called After the After. Not the hour following contact, but the week after, when adrenaline faded and the silence echoed. They taught men to voice how their air felt inside. A senior chief, Torres, dismissed it as soft until it steadied a young soldier who lacked words but had a friend with a checklist. Torres stopped mocking it then. One night, far from anything familiar, the enemy probed their perimeter with patience rather than fire. Waiting was harder than moving. Elena studied wavering lines on a screen until they hardened into purpose. Not tonight, she said to no one in particular, shifting 3 pieces on a board only 6 could read. The probe faded. The men slept a little sounder. No medal came for that, just the quiet, which was better. By the time Reaper's shadow took shape as a name, Marcus still had nothing to say. That was fine. Elena hadn't sworn her oath to sway one man's opinion. She'd taken it to uphold her corner of a sky the country rested beneath, often ungrateful, mostly unaware. The SEAL teams didn't need a daughter who won holiday arguments. They needed maps that told the truth and a voice that held firm when others faltered. Elena didn't become a warrior by becoming someone else. She became herself by muting the noise of the unnecessary and tuning into the hum beneath the plan. At first, she mistook it for fear. Later, she recognized it as responsibility, vibrating at the frequency of men who trusted her. Years later, that hum would cross a crowded room in Willow Creek and steal the breath from Javier, once her student, now a SEAL. He would whisper the name she never claimed. And Marcus would face a story that didn't fit his neatly arranged world. Silence at home didn't begin with a slammed door. It started with mail returned to sender. After her first deployment, Elena wrote letters, honest, stripped of classified details but rich with the weather. She described how the Gulf could be cruel and generous in a single night, how steady voices saved more lives than loud ones, how logistics proved courage wasn't fleeting. She included a photo of herself as San Antonio Pier, pelican case in hand, wind tugging her hair. Weeks later, the envelope returned, her handwriting creased, the flap unopened. A postal stamp branded her name with indifference. Elena tucked it into a drawer with mismatched forks and spare batteries, learning the shape of a verdict without a signature. Clara kept a fragile bridge open. Sunday calls came at odd hours, her voice worn with the small news that sustained Elena. The church bake sale ran late. Mrs. Delgado's roses bloomed crimson. The neighbor's boy learned to ride without training wheels, crashing triumphantly into a shrub but laughing as he stood. Clara asked if Elena ate anything green, if she'd found a chapel, if birds sang where she was. When Elena paused too long, Clara filled the silence with a poem, reading a single line that softened the barracks' edges. She never pressed for details. She trusted Elena's claim of safety, a faith Elena never earned and still longed for. When Elena pinned on Lieutenant, she sent 2 photos, one for Clara, one for Marcus. Clara's stayed on the mantel beside Elena's childhood pottery bowl. Marcus's came back, folded once across her face, without a word. Elena smoothed it flat and buried it under a stack of orders until the crease became a scar she could trace with her thumb. Illness crept into the Holt house like an early frost, whispers at first, then a morning when the windows wore delicate patterns of pain. Biopsy, Clara said, pronouncing it like a student's name she hoped to get wrong. Marcus began emailing, his notes as stark as tide charts, numbers, dates, no flourishes. He used "we" for doctor visits and "she" for suffering. When hospice parked out front, Elena was already en route, her forehead pressed to an airplane window, reflecting a woman who looked more at ease in motion than at rest. The Holt house had reshaped itself around Clara's bed. The glass case of metals gleamed like a defiant memory. Marcus stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, as if his posture could anchor the horizon. When Clara woke, her hand reached through the air until it found Elena's sleeve. "Keep soaring," she whispered, her breath uneven. "Not away, just up." The nurse looked down, fussing with a sheet to hide her quiet tears. Before dawn, Clara set down the light she'd carried for them all, and the room learned a new silence. At the funeral, the pastor spoke with sincerity, and the congregation nodded, relieved by words that fit their grief. Marcus spoke first, so Elena went second. He recounted the oak tree story, how a storm felled it but spared the flagpole, and no one corrected the shifting winds in his tale. Elena spoke of Clara's grating pencil, wielded with mercy, and how lemon oil and library books blended in their home. She described a kitchen always spacious enough for one more chair, because Clara believed meals could translate love. Marcus's jaw tightened, like a man grinding salt without grain. Afterward, casseroles arrived under foil lids, and neighbors touched Marcus's arm, calling him sir even in his own kitchen. He allowed it. Elena washed dishes until her hands wrinkled, pondering how grief is an inventory of what endures. When she left, she didn't say, "Call me." She knew he wouldn't. Instead, she did something gentler, straightened a crooked frame on the wall, kissed her palm, pressed it to a photo capturing Clara's laugh mid-bloom, and walked out. Back at work near Fort Bliss, Elena added a line to the pre-brief, "Who calls your people if it goes wrong?" Chief Torres didn't flinch. He began carrying a laminated card with 4 numbers and told the team to do the same. They built another habit: after the after-action review, ask a quiet man what the plan sounded like in his head. It saved them twice before anyone admitted its worth. Culture shifts slower than a Hello's flight path, but they persisted. Sometimes, in the late hours when courage dressed as sleeplessness, Elena called Marcus. He answered with a cautious hello, like a man expecting a telemarketer. She asked about the roof shingles, the porch's stain, whether the old flag needed replacing. He asked if she'd checked her tire pressure, if the desert softened her boots. They spoke in nouns. After hanging up, Elena ran a mile in the dark until her breath remembered its owner. Promotions arrived like unseasonal weather. The Reaper's shadow nickname spread beyond the rooms it belonged in. Elena didn't chase it. Javier sent a postcard from a training school he'd once sworn he wasn't fit to teach at, writing, "Your checklists make sense." She taped it to her wall with blue tape because some truths should leave a mark when they're gone. Marcus sent a birthday card, his name typed beneath the closing, like he'd signed a permission slip. The absence of handwriting said more than the words. A woman from their church, with eyes kind as a stockpile of casseroles, sent Elena a note in flowing cursive, *, he keeps your picture in his study. He doesn't talk about it, *. Elena read it twice and slipped it into her notebook. Love can be a pantry others fill for you. It can also be a lock you learn to navigate. When the Navy pinned a ribbon on Elena for a mission ode to 12 hands and 2 sharp instincts, she mailed the program to Marcus with a sticky note, "We did right that night." It returned with a single line in his stark, precise script, "They're making you a symbol," as if the worst fate for a woman was to become a shorthand for men's valor. Elena tucked the note beneath the photo he'd returned folded years ago, archiving the unspoken. She resisted narrating her life to him. It's tempting when you grow up with a judge on the porch. Instead, she shared her stories with those who'd lived them, Torres, who grunted, Javier, who laughed like absolution, the chaplain, who offered a hand on her shoulder when words about faith weren't needed. The teams knocked on her table before rough nights. She knocked back. That was their ritual. On leave, Elena parked across from Willow Creek's community center, watching men in ball caps and pressed jeans file in. Marcus held the door for 2 widows, saying something that made them touch his arm. He's not an unkind man, Elena reminded herself. He's a man whose kindness was shelved, boxed in by years he couldn't reach past. Elena drove away from the community center before Marcus's actions could demand a conversation. In the quiet, she learned that approval and respect were distinct currencies. Approval spent easily, buying applause. Respect bought sleep. Her work taught her to measure days by those who returned home, not by those who knew her name. Silence, used well, was a refuge. Used poorly, it was a cage. Elena refused to inhabit the one Marcus built, so she crafted her own, with open windows and a door the men could knock on twice. The invitation to the Veterans' Night arrived via a cousin in Willow Creek, whose emails still carried the hesitancy of a novice typist. "It would mean a lot to your mother's friends," she wrote. "And there's cake." Elena checked her schedule, felt the pull of her town's tradition of flags against wooden siding, and agreed. She didn't tell Marcus she was coming. She didn't need him to greet her at the door. She needed her boots to carry her into a room where other soldiers' stories lined the walls, letting hers rest quietly among them. In a room that understood service's cost, a sentence that betrayed that knowledge didn't provoke a gasp. It triggered a recalibration, a subtle shift of weight on chair legs, as people chose whether to stand or shrink. Elena didn't yet know Marcus would choose the sentence he did. But she knew this, she had learned to stand. And if the moment demanded, she would stand so still the room could find its balance. The first time Elena realized the SEAL teams were her family, they stood ankle-deep in Gulf water near San Antonio, smelling of copper and diesel, waiting for the weather to take sides. The wind tilted the channel, radios hissing like they'd sprouted fins. They'd drilled the plan enough to dream it, but plans were rumors until the night signed its name. Elena sat at a folding table with a marker and a checklist Chief Torres called scripture. He approached, boots leaving fleeting craters in the rain-soaked ground. "Widow," he said, bypassing her rank in private moments. "Need another set of eyes?" "I need your doubt," Elena replied, sliding him the board. "If it holds up, the plan will." Torres ran a knuckle down the column, grunting at a weak link, a backup pump with a history of failing. "You put the flaw where we can see it," he said. "Soft fails belong on the table," Elena answered. "Hard ones come uninvited." He nodded, satisfied, like an older brother when you finally lift what you couldn't last season. They moved. The night bent once, then complied, not because luck favored them, but because the plan had room for storms. Back at the pier, Javier, still green enough to apologize for breathing too loudly, lingered near Elena's table. "Ma'am," he said, cheeks flushed with cold and relief, "you called the pump before it failed." "I called the probability," Elena corrected. "That's all you can carry." He considered this, then set his jaw like a young man nudged toward confidence. "Thanks for making space I could fit in," he said. It was the finest compliment Elena ever received. Maps that carried men were love letters in their line of work. Between rotations, Elena and her team rewrote training blocks no one craved because they lacked cinematic flair. She added modules like spare ribs around a plan's heart, after, for the week when adrenaline faded, noise discipline for the soul, for speaking hard truths without breaking trust, and the boring parts, forcing new recruits to brief mundane steps until they grasped that boredom was scaffolding. You only noticed when it collapsed. Torres scoffed at the titles, then laminated them and claimed them as his own. "Widow's Chapel," he muttered, rolling his eyes. "Everyone leaves with their boots." They built rituals, knocked twice on Elena's table before heading out. The wood would remember and bring them back. Ask, "How's your air?" in the mess line and wait for the reply. The waiting was the point. Carry a card with 4 phone numbers for when everything fell through the worst gap. Don't skip the dull steps thinking you're above them. The Gulf loved exceptional men and kept them. A medic with hands steady enough to mend a dragonfly visited and approved their lists, adding one line in neat block print. Who checks the checker? Elena kept it. It saved them once when a proud man forgot he was mortal, and a quiet one remembered for him. Loss came, as it always did. A diver the Gulf refused to return. Dress blues, rigid with grief, a bell tolling numbers that never matched the void. Afterward, a young soldier, with a face like the brother Elena never had, stood before her and asked how to carry it. "You don't," she said. "You walk with it. There's a difference." He nodded, as men do when handed a truth they didn't want, pocketing it anyway. Reputation was a slow river. You didn't notice it carving until the bank reshaped itself. The nickname Reaper's Shadow, which Elena refused to claim aloud, drifted into rooms she never entered. A visiting captain shook her hand near Fort Bliss and said, "So you're the Reaper," testing the name like a coin's weight. "I draw maps," Elena replied. He grinned. "Maps that make men feel untouchable for 10 minutes. That's a chapel." He wasn't wrong, nor entirely right. Men were never untouchable. They were sometimes united, which was better. Young soldiers wrote Elena notes they were shy to sign. "Ma'am," one scribbled, "your checklists kept my mind honest." Another, "I sleep now, thanks." Chief Torres named his second daughter Elena, saying the name could run. Javier, who once scoffed at asking about air, began doing it with a voice steady as a bench. They started a tradition of sharing one mundane story before briefs. "Walk me through the gate you didn't take," Elena would say. It built a muscle memory for restraint, honed by pausing, not rushing. Javier's first attempt had too many flourishes. By his third, it was lean, like a map, spare, precise, humble. "Gate looked like it was apologizing," he said. "I don't take those from structures anymore." On a humid night near San Antonio, when the radio sulked, a strange calm settled over the comms where tension should have sharpened. Patterns in Elena's peripheral vision hinted at trouble. "They're testing patience," she said. The nastiest weapon on quiet nights. She shifted 3 pieces on a board only 6 could read. The test fizzled before it became a story. No one pinned anything on anyone. The men slept. Elena counted those as her best victories, the ones the world couldn't claim. Love arrived once, wearing an easy smile and a civilian schedule. He liked how Elena laughed, like someone who'd earned every breath and wanted to share it. He didn't like her phone ringing at 2 a.m., or how she left without promising a return time. They tried. He wanted to fix her calendar. She wanted to redefine his idea of courage. They parted before it turned bitter. "You deserve someone whose storms don't have names," Elena told him. "You deserve to be understood," he replied. They were both right, and not each other's answer. Javier grew into his boots like an oak, steady and slow, until one spring he stood taller than the fence. He learned to command a room with fewer words, to nod at fear without handing over control. When Elena watched him brief a plan, leaving room for reality's weight, she wrote good in her notebook and underlined it twice. He'd be the man to see her across a crowded community center years later, breath-catching for a moment. First, he had to learn to hold it and share it deliberately. Elena visited a chapel on base, its pews more scuffed than the gym's floor. The chaplain, with eyes that carried the weight of names, said, "You're pastoring, you know." Elena laughed. "I'm managing risk." He tilted his head. Same sacrament, different incense. She jotted it down, pretending she wouldn't keep it. They failed too, because families do. A plan Elena trusted betrayed her when pride slipped in, disguised as confidence. She'd skipped a mundane step, thinking they were above it. No one died, luck, not skill. She stood before the room and admitted, "I got fancy." The men nodded, they'd done it too. Then they retraced the gate they should have taken and secured it from the right side. When awards came, Elena signed their backs and mailed them to mothers. "Your boy," she wrote, even for men with grayer knees than hers, made 10 others stand taller. She kept copies of the letters, as memory was an unreliable clerk. In the gear cage, where equipment breathed between missions, Elena taped a page to a steel locker, "Respect is logistics." It drew a laugh, then a following. The more they scheduled dignity, the fewer disasters tried to settle in. The soul, it turned out, thrived on checklists. Back in Willow Creek, Marcus's silence held its rigid posture. He was still the man thanked at the feed store for a past they recognized. He still told the oak tree story, now with added thunder for effect. Elena didn't write to correct him. She wrote plans for men who'd be alive next month because she chose a deliberate pace. What the teams gave Elena wasn't a name, it was a home. Not with walls, but with rituals. Knock twice, ask about air, put the soft veil on the table, say the hard thing before the night says it for you. Stand so still others remember how. On the night in the Willow Creek Community Center, when Marcus chose a sentence that shrank the room, those men, her family, would make it taller with the oldest ritual, recognition. The map had been drawing itself for years. The community center in Willow Creek, Texas, had its own climate, coffee steam, waxed floors, and the weathered laughter of old soldiers. Flags sagged from brass poles like weary sentinels. On the stage, a wooden lectern bore scratches like a face carries age. People Elena had known since childhood wove through the folding chairs with plates of sheet cake, moving with the small-town grace that endured even when the world overlooked it. She'd come to sit quietly in the back, clap for the names read aloud, and drive away along the creek with her windows down, letting the town speak in the rustle of oaks. Marcus found her before the pledge. He was a landmark in such rooms. Men in ball caps called him sir. Women, without thinking, grazed his elbow as they passed, as if luck lingered in his sleeve. He positioned himself between Elena and the aisle, like a man preparing for an unrequested speech. The young SEAL beside him, Javier, stood at ease with an effortless precision. Elena recognized him before she recalled his name. You could spot a team member not by the insignia, but by how their eyes counted exits. Gentlemen, Marcus said, raising his voice just enough to claim the room, may I borrow your ears? It wasn't a question. Conversations folded, forks hovered midair. He didn't look at Elena as he spoke. His gaze swept past her, as if she were a smudge he could erase with a better angle. Al-Shabaab would laugh at a daughter like her, he declared, his tone as certain as a weather report, as if the clouds had already arrived. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed into a napkin. A veteran in the second row squinted, hoping he'd misheard. The old floorboards seemed to listen, tuned to Willow Creek's frequencies of pride and shame. Marcus clapped Javier's shoulder, staking a claim with his palm. Now this, he announced, his voice warming to the performance, is a true warrior. He squeezed, tuning his pride like an instrument. Javier didn't smile. He turned to Elena. Recognition was a quiet detonation. First, a faint flinch at the corners of his eyes. Then a hard swallow, high in his throat. Then his shoulders squared to something only he could see. He froze, breath catching on an invisible hook. The room caught the silence like a fever. He spoke softly, but rooms like this carried what they chose. Are you the Reaper's shadow? The words rippled through the chairs like a current. A veteran in the back straightened, another removed his cap absently. Someone whispered, what did he say? A widow beside him murmured, she's somebody. The ceiling fans spun slowly, as if the air hadn't thickened. Marcus's mouth tried a smile that didn't fit. Some nickname, he said to the room, dismissive. Stories grow taller in the telling. Javier's gaze held Elena's. Ma'am, he said, louder now, his voice steadied by respect, you wove the net at El Paso. You laid the routes at Las Cruces when the trucks. He stopped, mindful of classification, like a rhythm he'd memorized. You kept us breathing. We owe you. Elena hadn't asked for testimony. She never liked what it did to a room. Team effort, she said. Always. A man near the trophy case cleared his throat. Which outfit, he asked, reflex outweighing curiosity. Javier shrugged, guarding specifics while offering the core. Enough, he said, a soldier's way of saying everything vital without breaking what still needed mending. Marcus shifted, drawing himself taller, reaching for authority as the ground beneath him redrew itself. She files papers, he muttered, half to himself, half to the veterans who'd let him narrate their world for decades. She doesn't, Javier cut in, respect wrapped around steel. With respect, sir, she doesn't file. It wasn't defiance, it was a correction, delivered in the language of a world where stakes included what men carried into the dark. The room seemed to think. Veterans leaned forward on chair legs. The MC, a woman who'd patched half the town's scraped knees, hovered near the microphone, then set it down. She knew better than to interrupt a space finding its new weight. A cousin with Clara's eyebrows murmured, to no one and everyone, Uncle Marcus, I think maybe you don't know all she is. The community center in Willow Creek, Texas, had its own climate, coffee steam, waxed floors, and the weathered laughter of old soldiers. Flags sagged from brass poles like weary sentinels. On the stage, a wooden lectern bore scratches like a face carries age. People Elena had known since childhood wove through the folding chairs with plates of sheet cake, moving with the small-town grace that endured even when the world overlooked it. She'd come to sit quietly in the back, clap for the names read aloud, and drive away along the creek with her windows down, letting the town speak in the rustle of oaks. Marcus found her before the pledge. He was a landmark in such rooms. Men in ball caps called him sir. Women, without thinking, grazed his elbow as they passed, as if luck lingered in his sleeve. He positioned himself between Elena and the aisle, like a man preparing for an unrequested speech. The young SEAL beside him, Javier, stood at ease with an effortless precision. Elena recognized him before she recalled his name. You could spot a team member not by the insignia, but by how their eyes counted exits. Gentlemen, Marcus said, raising his voice just enough to claim the room, may I borrow your ears? It wasn't a question. Conversations folded, forks hovered midair. He didn't look at Elena as he spoke. His gaze swept past her, as if she were a smudge he could erase with a better angle. Al-Shabaab would laugh at a daughter like her, he declared, his tone as certain as a weather report, as if the clouds had already arrived. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed into a napkin. A veteran in the second row squinted, hoping he'd misheard. The old floorboards seemed to listen, tuned to Willow Creek's frequencies of pride and shame. Marcus clapped Javier's shoulder, staking a claim with his palm. Now this, he announced, his voice warming to the performance, is a true warrior. He squeezed, tuning his pride like an instrument. Javier didn't smile. He turned to Elena. Recognition was a quiet detonation. First, a faint flinch at the corners of his eyes. Then a hard swallow, high in his throat. Then his shoulders squared to something only he could see. He froze, breath catching on an invisible hook. The room caught the silence like a fever. He spoke softly, but rooms like this carried what they chose. Are you the Reaper's shadow? The words rippled through the chairs like a current. A veteran in the back straightened, another removed his cap absently. Someone whispered, what did he say? A widow beside him murmured, she's somebody. The ceiling fans spun slowly, as if the air hadn't thickened. Marcus's mouth tried a smile that didn't fit. Some nickname, he said to the room, dismissive. Stories grow taller in the telling. Javier's gaze held Elena's. Ma'am, he said, louder now, his voice steadied by respect, you wove the net at El Paso. You laid the routes at Las Cruces when the trucks. He stopped, mindful of classification, like a rhythm he'd memorized. You kept us breathing. We owe you. Elena hadn't asked for testimony. She never liked what it did to a room. Team effort, she said. Always. A man near the trophy case cleared his throat. Which outfit, he asked, reflex outweighing curiosity. Javier shrugged, guarding specifics while offering the core. Enough, he said, a soldier's way of saying everything vital without breaking what still needed mending. Marcus shifted, drawing himself taller, reaching for authority as the ground beneath him redrew itself. She files papers, he muttered, half to himself, half to the veterans who'd let him narrate their world for decades. She doesn't, Javier cut in, respect wrapped around steel. With respect, sir, she doesn't file. It wasn't defiance, it was a correction, delivered in the language of a world where stakes included what men carried into the dark. The room seemed to think. Veterans leaned forward on chair legs. The MC, a woman who'd patched half the town's scraped knees, hovered near the microphone, then set it down. She knew better than to interrupt a space finding its new weight. A cousin with Clara's eyebrows murmured, to no one and everyone, Uncle Marcus, I think maybe you don't know all she is. Silence could be a hammer. That night in the Willow Creek Community Center, it was a door. People began to walk through. A Vietnam veteran stood, his jacket rustling like dry leaves. He didn't salute, he placed a hand over his heart. The gesture spread, one man, then another, then a woman with a service ribbon pinned to her blouse. Javier, who'd been lingering by the coffee urn, trying to blend into the background, snapped to attention without meaning to, his chest rising like a tide finding the moon again. No one called attention on deck. That belonged to other nights. But the old ritual of recognition moved through the room, quiet, unshowy, the body's honest response to merit. Marcus stared at the flag, using it as a shield. He muttered legend-making under his breath, a small stone lobbed at a glass he knew was already fractured. It's not a legend, Javier said, eyes still on Elena, his voice gentle, offering Marcus a map rather than a judgment. It's a record. Elena set her cup down, the sound too loud in the quiet. I didn't come for this, she said to the room, because humility was a truth, and so was setting boundaries. I came to sit among those who know what service costs. A woman from church, her white hair coiled into a practical bun, stepped closer. We can do both, she said. Sit and understand. She touched Elena's forearm, the way she once steadied children on the school's waxed floors. Marcus turned to Elena, his face holding a storm, clouds unsure if they carried thunder or mercy. If this is true, he said, his voice catching on a breath he tried to hide, why didn't you tell me? Because you never asked would have been easy, but truth wasn't always kind. Because I couldn't, Elena said, leaving it there. He heard the rest. Javier stepped forward, not to crowd the moment but to bear witness. Sir, he said to Marcus, earnest without apology, we owe her. Some of us owe her birthdays. It wasn't a unit citation. It was heavier. The MC, a woman who'd bandaged half the town's scraped knees, tried the microphone again. It squealed, then complied. "Let's take 5, she said, ever the peacemaker. Coffee's hot. Cake's not getting younger." She didn't define their purpose. The room understood honor as action, not a feeling. Movement eased the tension. People lined up at the coffee urn, practicing the small talk that carried big truths. "We're proud of you," said a man who taught Elena to bait a hook at 9. "Always were," his wife added, rewriting their history with a kindness that held towns together. Elena thanked them with the quiet she reserved for words that healed. Marcus drifted closer. He looked at Elena's face, not as a judge, but as a man reading a manual in a language he should have learned decades ago. "I expected a son," he said, each word placed like it might detonate. "That was my mistake." He swallowed. "I don't know how to be this." "A student," Elena offered. "Small," he said, almost smiling at his own candor. "Wrong," he added. "Then start there," she said. She didn't reach for his hand. Mercy wasn't always touch. Javier raised his cup toward Elena, a subtle salute. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady, "thank you for the boring checklists." "The boring parts keep us," she replied. He looked at Marcus with the complex respect a good man offers the past. "Sir," he said, "you raised someone who brings men home." Marcus didn't know where to place that sentence. He let it rest between them like a folded flag. When they returned to the chairs, the pledge sounded different, voices lower, steadier, as if they felt part of the story they spoke. During the reading of names, a few heads turned toward Elena, not seeking details but full-on recognition. By the closing prayer, the room settled into a new ordinary. People pushed back chairs, reached for coats, but the ordinary had shifted. The floor knew it, the picture frames on the wall knew it, the scratched lectern knew it, as if stories had been etched into it by hands during forgotten speeches. They'd edited Willow Creek gently, and it had agreed. Outside, the night smelled of rain reconsidering its plans. Marcus stepped into the doorway, hands in his pockets like a truce. "Drive safe," he said, a phrase men use when they mean a dozen things they can't yet voice. "Always," Elena replied. Javier knocked twice on the lintel as he passed under it, leaving the Willow Creek Community Center. Habit, ritual, love. The sound was small yet vast, the kind of knock that lingered years later when rooms fell silent and Elena needed to remember how to stand. The town folded into evening like an old flag into a triangle, corners meeting precisely. Elena didn't drive straight out. She took the long road past the diner's neon glow and the hardware store still selling nails by the pound. The creek ran dark, cradling the moon's reflection. She pulled into a turnout where teenagers once parked, swearing eternal promises, and let the engine settle into silence. The night pressed close, letting her hear her own thoughts. Her phone buzzed once, then again. The first message, from an unknown number, read, "Ma'am, I was in the hall. Didn't know what to say then. Thank you for getting my brother home." The second was from Javier, didn't mean to start a scene. Just wanted to tell the truth out loud once. Elena typed back, "You did fine. The room needed air. We gave it some." Her breath steadied, her ribs no longer guarding secrets but doing their true work. She slept in the base guest quarters that night, memory made a poor mattress. In the morning, Elena ran the perimeter road near Fort Bliss until her lungs stepped back from the edge they'd been pacing. The sun rose gently, as if it knew of the night and didn't want to disturb it. A young sailor jogging past offered water without a word, the way those who recognized exhaustion shared what they could. By late morning, Elena stood on Marcus's porch in Willow Creek. The paint begged for a fresh coat. She ran a thumb over a blistered spot, feeling the history of weather in it. Marcus opened the door, holding a mug like a shield. The scent of coffee folded time. They took their places at the kitchen table, Marcus at the head, Elena by the window, ready to leave if needed. "I didn't know," Marcus said, not as defense or accusation, but as a tally. For words that cost him more than he could voice. "I didn't tell you," Elena replied, then added what mattered. "I couldn't, and you didn't ask." He weighed her words like a man measuring grain. A flicker of the fairness that once made him a good lieutenant returned to his eyes, humbler now. "I expected a son," he said. "I thought legacy followed one path." He exhaled a breath that had been hiding for 20 years. "I was wrong." Elena didn't rush to absolve him. Mercy wasn't a ticket to cash at a counter. "Names get heavy," she said. "I carried a different kind of weight." Marcus glanced at the glass case. The metals inside reflected them, two figures leaning toward a past that wouldn't budge. "They called you," he couldn't say it, the words catching in his throat, too romantic for a man who believed the truest language was a surname and a service number. "It's just a nickname," Elena said. "A handle. What matters is what you lived with it." He traced a circle on the table where the varnish had bubbled years ago from a hot pot Elena had set down. He'd lectured her for an hour then. Now his finger lingered there, an apology. "Do you want me there?" he asked, his voice smaller than she'd ever heard. "At anything. I don't know what you do that as chairs." "There's always a seat," Elena said. "You choose where to put your hands." They said little after that. They didn't need to. Sometimes the bravest words were the ones left unspoken. Before leaving, Elena rinsed her cup and set it upside down to dry, as Clara had taught her. At the door, Marcus cleared his throat. "Proud," he said, plain, then softer, as if afraid to startle it, "even when I didn't know how." Elena nodded. "Do the knowing now." It wasn't permission, it was a map. Back at the command near Fort Bliss, Elena's inbox hummed with echoes from the community center. A widow wrote, "We stood because you stood there." A high school friend messaged, "I thought tough meant loud. Learned something last night." The chaplain wrote, "Old rooms can change their minds." Yours did. Command asked Elena to brief a working group on human factors and durable readiness, bureaucratic shorthand for the boring parts that kept men alive. She agreed, bringing one slide, respect as logistics. It drew a laugh, then a focused silence as pens scratched. Elena explained truths they kept rediscovering, scheduling dignity reduced surprises, asking how's your air, saved as many lives as a better battery, humility was maintenance. Afterward, a young officer caught her in the hallway. "Ma'am, how do you lead when the room resents your pronouns?" Elena thought of herself at 20, standing in a Willow Creek kitchen scented with lemon oil, stripped of flourishes. "Show your math," she told the young officer. "Share your credit. Knock twice before you enter any soul." The officer scribbled it on her palm like a mission order. A week passed, then two. An envelope arrived, addressed in Marcus's precise, unyielding script, handwriting Elena would recognize across a crowded room. Inside was a clipping from the Willow Creek Gazette, a 3-paragraph report about the Veterans' Night, with a line noting the community stood to honor service. Beneath, in Marcus's tight script, "I should have stood sooner." Elena pinned it to the wall beside a map of a county that needed no mapping, letting it shift how she moved through a place she thought she knew. Javier stopped by on his way to teach a training block he'd once sworn he wasn't ready for. He brought his mother's pecan pie in a dented tin and a discomfort with Elena's office chair. They sat on crates, chairs lied about power. "I didn't freeze to make him small," Javier said. "I froze because truth caught up, and I didn't want to drop it." "You held it," Elena said. That was enough. He knocked twice on the door jamb as he left, the small sum there shared amen. On a Saturday, with the Texas sky rehearsing spring, Elena visited the cemetery. Grass had reclaimed the patches grief had worn thin. She stood by Clara's stone, pressing her palm to its surface. Skin carried messages air couldn't. "We're learning," Elena said. Slow, but not backward. A breeze stirred the oaks, rustling pages somewhere unseen. People asked Elena about the nickname Reaper's Shadow. They wanted its origin, the first night it was spoken, the neat arc of myth and moment. She told them the truth, it didn't matter who said it. What mattered was what you did when handed a name you didn't choose. You could perform it for a lifetime, or wield it like a tool, lever, ladder, pry bar, to lift what needed lifting. Elena chose the latter. When she heard Reaper's Shadow, she thought of the soft veil laid bare on the table, the mundane step that kept a man's birthday on the calendar, the room that stood because one person held steady. Those in the community center that night would recall a distinct sound, chair legs shifting forward, then rising, the oak floor accepting weight it had waited to bear. It wasn't applause was fleeting and greedy. This was steadier, the sound a town made when it revised itself toward courage. Blood didn't salute that night. Honor did. That was the sentence Elena kept, not for flattery, but for where it guided her hands when old rooms met new storms. For those who felt the story's weight, who remembered someone who stood for them when others wouldn't, or a room reshaped by a spoken truth, Elena's journey offered a quiet invitation: pause, reflect, and carry forward. If it stirred a memory of courage lent or borrowed, it was a moment worth sharing, a map for someone else's hard night. Her story, built on service, mercy, and quiet reckonings, was one to pass along to those needing direction. It was a reminder that standing straighter often came from standing together.